When I started out, I felt like I believed that the way to connect with the audience would be to have like the perfect opening joke.
Hello and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. On the show, I interview peak performing innovators in the creative, social impact, and earth conservation spaces who are working to change the world. This episode is brought to you by Brain FM. Brain FM combines the best of music and neuroscience to help you relax, focus, meditate, and even sleep. I love it and have been using it to write, create, and do some of my deepest work. Because you're a listener of the show, you can get a free trial. Head over to brain.fm/innovative mindset to check it out. If you decide to subscribe, you can get 20% off with the coupon code Innovative Mindset, all one word. And now, let's get to the show. Hey there, and welcome to the Innovative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. I am super honored that you've taken the time to be here with me and with my amazing guest today on the show. I have to tell you about Mike Kaplan. Mike Kaplan is a comedian who's appeared on The Tonight Show, Conan, Letterman, James Corden, Seth Meyers, Comedy Central, Last Comic Standing, and America's Got Talent. He has a 1-hour stand-up special on Amazon, which is called Small, Dork, and Handsome, which I love. And he's got 2 podcasts, The Faucet and Broccoli and Ice Cream. I can't wait to talk about what those names mean. His first album, Vegan Mind Meld, was one of iTunes' top 10 comedy albums of the year, and his newest album, AKA, debuted at number 1. The New York Times called it invigoratingly funny and included it among its 5 coronavirus best new comedy specials to remind you of the old normal. Mike, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
So let's jump right in. First of all, this is a strange question because comedians are usually funny, but what got you into comedy? What was the inspiration to go, you know what? I'm funny. I want to do this on purpose.
Thanks for asking. For me, I actually didn't get into comedy because I planned to. I was earlier in life a musician. My parents were both music teachers, and so I started playing the violin when I was 4 by not entirely my own choice, just like, the family business.
Right.
And so I was playing violin for years and not specifically enjoying it, but it was sort of perhaps the same way that some other children are brought along to church or synagogue or mosque or whatever kind of religious bill. Like, we go here, so you go here. And
Right.
so every Saturday for most of my childhood, I would go to a music school, learn theory, I would participate in orchestra and various quartets and ensembles and master classes. And I took on another day separately private lessons. And just throughout the course of my childhood, I received all of this, this music education and messaging in a way against my will until when I was a teenager, I started playing the guitar because a friend of mine had a guitar and it was fun and I didn't have to and I wasn't made to. And it was actually a friend from a summer camp called Bucks Rock, which was founded by a man and a woman, Ernst and Ilse Bulova. Ernst had studied with Maria Montessori, and so the camp was sort of Montessori inspired in that you didn't have to go anywhere at any particular time. You just had to go somewhere. You had to, do something, but there was no scheduling of your every moment. You were free to do the things that you wanted to do. And I remember Ernst saying once, children don't like to be taught, but they do like to learn. And that seems to be the case for, children of all ages, which is, I think, what I call adults, just children as well. So there I was, I think, being taught the violin, but choosing to learn and play. I felt like I was playing the guitar. I didn't feel like I was even practicing. I'd played for hours, like probably, my mother would have loved if I practiced the violin as much as I practiced the guitar. But so I loved playing the guitar, and I started writing songs that some of them were funny, some of them weren't. Like, I was sort of very I loved They Might Be Giants. I loved Ani DeFranco. So, if you can imagine a
That's a
melding of those
combo.
two, yeah. And so I would play at, there would be talent shows at camp or coffee house nights. And when I got to college, I would play at like this venue on campus. And then when I was old enough to get into bars, I was trying to be a singer songwriter. And one of the places that I found when I was exploring where I could perform my songs was a comedy club.
Mm.
I was searching for kind of clubs in general in sort of a pre-Google Googling landscape, and I found this place, the Comedy Studio. I called up Rick Jenkins, the owner then and the owner still, answered, and I was like, "I hear that you have a place for performing, and I have songs that are funny. Is that appropriate for your comedy venue?" And he's like, "Sure, we can give you 5 minutes." And so I went, and I loved doing it. I mean, I loved, like, there was an audience that laughed at the things that, not
Sure.
only the songs that I'd prepared, but also like before and in between them. I, just kind of like, there was one particular. I mean, I was going on right after Jonathan Katz, who at the time, or very recently, had a TV show on Comedy Central called Dr. Katz Professional Therapist, and he was a person who I had heard of and
Mm.
liked, and
Hmm.
and he ended his set with a song, and I went on after, and I think I just sort of uh, let let the truth come out that I was like, this is my first time, and I'm following the most famous person in the room who's doing, in a sense, the thing that I'm about to try to be doing, but with years of experience and polish
Mm.
behind it. And so I expressed that anxiety, and people, I think, found it endearing, and or whatever it was, they laughed at the things I said, and that was sort of like a light bulb kind of moment where it's like, oh, I could do it's in linguistics, which I studied in undergrad and grad school. We talked about. I feel like sometimes when people hear that I studied linguistics, they get concerned that I might be about to correct their grammar in a way that maybe if you meet somebody who is a psychologist, you might be like, "Oh no, please don't like psychoanalyze me based on the things that I'm saying." Be like, well, I can't help but respond to what you're actually saying and doing. You're like, "No, that's what I said not to do." But the goal of linguistics is not to tell people, to prescribe to people how they should talk. It's more to describe to people, or describe about people how we do talk, how, like, looking at what is, not describing what ought be. And so getting into comedy, actually, I found out, like, I wasn't prescribing that I should do it. I wasn't planning to do it. I wasn't like, I'm funny, therefore I ought do it. I didn't even. I mean, I had a sense that some of the songs were funny, but that wasn't the goal. But
Mm.
when people laughed at the things that I said that weren't even the songs that I'd planned, I was like, oh, I guess I am doing comedy. And so when people ask me, like, when did you know that you wanted to do comedy? The answer is like, well, it was a little after I started doing comedy. Unbeknownst to myself and my desires, I was like, oh, it became descriptive. And thus, then, which I think the way to figure out what you want to do in life is like, what are you doing? What are you enjoying? And can you keep doing that and more? So that is the, I guess, short, maybe medium length story of how I got into comedy.
Yeah, short to medium. I like it. It's, you and I have a lot in common. I started violin at 5 and I practiced 2 hours a day. And Abe Levine of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra was my teacher every Saturday
Mm.
morning for years on end. Yeah, it's interesting how parents don't actually necessarily ask you what you want to do, but instead go, this is what you're going to do. It's like that prescriptive, descriptive thing that you were talking about with linguistics
Hmm.
and psychology. Okay. So within everything that you've just said, there was so much. You found yourself doing comedy. You found yourself sort of following the thread of that. This is
Yes.
again a strange question because it's again, and this is the Innovative Mindset podcast, so I have to talk about mindset, or at least want to ask about mindset. Where do you think, it's not a muse question, really, it's more like, how did you, yeah, I guess I'll ask it this way. How did you get the push, the confidence to keep going? You said, well, I'm doing this. Can I keep doing it? That's great. But something in you went, I can make a living at this. I can pursue this and it's okay for me to do that. What was going on in your mind when you made those kind of decisions, even if they weren't necessarily on purpose? Today, I decide this is what I'm going to do.
Sure. Well, I think that it owes to at least two things, which may be the same thing, but that I was raised. I say this on stage sometimes, like that when I talk about being raised as a straight, white, cisgender American male Jew, almost across the board. The kind of person that is encouraged to speak, even if there isn't
Mm.
anything worthwhile to say, which, as you know, when I was starting out as a young to mid 20 something, like, I don't want to say that all 20 somethings don't have as much to say, because I think that that would be an ageist thing to say. I'll just say that I definitely didn't have as much to say when I was younger. And still, I'm sure that I won't have as. Actually, the very model that I'm sort of working in is I'm like, oh, as I got older, there's more worthwhile things to say, and also maybe I'm getting into listening more now too. So, but my family, and culture and society was such that I was an only child. I was an only grandchild. I was, as often in the secular Jewish family structure that I feel like a lot of at least a lot of the Jewish people that I know, like, grew up not particularly practicing religious, but culturally Jewish. For a group of people who have agreed that there has not yet been a Messiah, I feel like every, like, either firstborn or certainly every only child in a Jewish family, in my family, I was sort of like the local Messiah. Uh, like, told that I could do anything, that I could be anything. And there's a thing actually from the Talmud that I really like that sort of speaks to this. That I forget, I don't know the rabbi in question, but a rabbi presents the idea that in one pocket, like, say you have two pockets, in one pocket, he would carry a piece of paper that said, "This world was created for you," and in the other pocket, it would say, "You are nothing," or "We are nothing but ash and dust." And that those are sort of these great truths that are opposite and yet also both true, depending on, like, camera one, camera two, like, uh, and it could be of use in my own life and perhaps in the lives of others. That, like, the way that I conceive of it is, we are, like, I am, like, my consciousness, this incarnation, this time round, like, I am the center of my own experience. It seems to me that I'm the center of the universe. Also, I understand intellectually that I am not, and in the grandest scheme of things, in all of space and time, the moment that I am in right now, and even my entire life, is but a speck of dust. And so I feel like it's useful to, if I'm ever, or if you're ever, if anyone's ever at a point where they're like leaning too far in one direction, be like, oh man, I'm nothing. But remember, you are also, from another perspective, everything. And if you're, like, getting too big ahead about things, like, I am everything, be like, and remember also that you are nothing. That this balance, this equilibrium of those two truths is valuable, is meaningful. And this is all to say that growing up, I feel like my family really had their thumb down on the side of the scale of, this world was created for you. And
Mm.
I would only learn later that I was like, wait a second, I'm ash and dust as well. But when I was starting doing comedy, I was, just out of college, still in grad school, still, like, feeling like I was, like, like, just, like, growing, and that everything was for me. And so even if there were audiences, tons of audiences, that would have been like, hey, you're nothing but ash and dust, I'd be like, well, that's not what my grandmother says. That's not what my parents say. I've been given a very, like, hearty sort of constitution. Like, this foundation was laid, and it is important that I did eventually. I feel like it's sort of like a nice yin yang, like, at home, built up, and then out in public professionally, creatively, eroded away, but not eroded away completely, just, more like the statue of David or an elephant that's encased in marble, and the sculptor looks at it and then chips away everything that isn't an elephant
Right.
or the statue of David. And that is, I feel like, what at least, if not every comedian or artist is doing with themselves, like learning, becoming, chipping away, be like, oh, I try a joke like this, be like, maybe that's not the kind of joke that I want to tell. What about this? Yeah, no, not this one. Oh, yeah, this, yes, this, and then discovering, the soul, the spirit, the artistic being, persona, whatever it is, like within the metaphorical marble. And so, I mean, the short answer is, like, I had this delusional self confidence that was based in something real, that my family loved me. It was certainly true for them that I could do no wrong, that I could say no wrong, even though years later, I remember, actually before coming on, before performing on the very first cruise ship that I ever performed on, I talked to my grandmother, and I told her I was, like, concerned that the audiences might not be exactly the demographic that I was, like, that I've been performing for college students, and let's say, and I'm going on this cruise ship, and probably I imagined the makeup of the audience might be slightly different than people who are used to sitting and listening and thinking in the ways that I did, because I was also sort of one of them. And my grandmother was like, who wouldn't like the things you say? And I was like, well, it sounds like right now you don't like the things that I'm saying. So, that is all to say, I think that it is important for a comedian to have, at least in order to be a comedian, you need to believe that what you're doing is worthwhile enough to present to people who don't know you and don't already care about you, don't love you. So there needs to be, and in the beginning, before you've ever done it, like, you aren't theoretically good at it. How could you be good at a thing that you've never done? Like, even naturals have to work at it to become, to sort of unleash the power of that naturalness. And there might be, like, some very specific, like, exceptions to this, but most comedians, you ask, like, how good were you when you started? Not as good as I would become. And yet it's sort of like, maybe there's a Dunning-Kruger effect in action, where, in the beginning, there was so much I didn't know about what I didn't know, and I was still, like, just, like, brazenly confident. There's a joke that I would tell sometimes, where I was like, when I started, I thought I was good, but a year in, I looked back at those tapes and I was like, "Oh boy, that wasn't good. But thank God I'm good now." And then a year later, I'd look back at those tapes, like, "Whoa, thank God I'm good now." And just every year, being like, "Whew," like I'm running over a bridge of my past selves that's collapsing, and like, "Oh, thank God I got to hear the other side," and yet I'm still just on, one piece of bridge that will next year have collapsed, and I'll be like, "Ooh, thank God I'm here now." So I feel like there's an answer in there. If you want to chip away all the things that weren't the answer to the question that you asked, it was truly, I mean, my family, and the fact that I think our society, our patriarchy, values and encourages, men, boys to speak. And so, in a way, I got good at talking, even when I didn't have things that I wanted to talk about that were meaningful specifically. I got good at the how, and then eventually, over the course of life, I was like, and that's not to say that the jokes that I was writing when I was starting out weren't, funny or
Mm.
important to me, or, it's sort of like, there's a woman, do you know Linda Barry? She's a cartoonist and
Hmm.
writer.
Hmm.
And she has, I forget which book it is, in which she says a thing that I'll paraphrase. She asks the question, how old do you have to be to make a bad drawing? And, like, just the idea, imagine, a 2-year-old who's creating something that, if they become an amazing artist in their adulthood, you look back at what they're created when they were 2, and they might be like, well, that is not as good as what I would eventually come to be able to do. But it doesn't even make sense to talk of, like, the quality of a 2-year-old's, scribblings. It's just like, oh, the fact that you are doing it is the thing that gets you, to the next rung of the ladder, the next, step along the bridge. And so I look back at, my earliest jokes now, my earliest sets. I hope even sometimes last week, like, oh, I was just a baby. I was just a baby comedian. I was just a child. Like, isn't it great that I was even like, we celebrate when a child says their first word, regardless of what the word is. We're like, they talked, they did it, hooray! Like that is to be celebrated, and that is, I guess, I was sort of celebrating essentially without knowing it. Like, look, my first words as a comedian. Isn't this something? And
Right.
audiences are like, yeah, but what? And I feel like this, ultimately could blow out into the question of like, there's some comedians who are talking about like, it's like you can't say anything these days. As like, well, were you ever saying anything? Like, what is it that you want to say? It sounds like you're saying something, but you can. I rather Todd Glass is a comedian I love, and he's a person who I think succinctly put this is like, of course you can say anything, and what do you want to say? So in the beginning, I was just saying anything, regardless of like not even aware that there could be. I'm just here to say funny things. So sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're about things I care about, sometimes they're not. But I'm just like, if I'm gonna be a comedian, I gotta talk on stage, and so I think it did. Maybe it was also a matter of like the descriptive. I'm like, I like this turning into the prescriptive. Well, then I want to keep having this experience which ultimately the goal is to have the audience and me enjoying myself. But I'm like, but I'm starting from me enjoying myself. So it was also that, which is also, I think, connected to my parents, my family encouraging me to, live a life that is not only, hedonistically, selfishly happy, but, to hopefully find things that create joy and fulfillment and engagement and connection and communion with myself and others. So that, I guess, ultimately, I don't know if that was all explicitly stated in my psyche at the time. At the time, I was just like, people are laughing. I want to keep it happening.
So much of it is that. So much of it is that immediate relationship with your audience. When I'm on stage, it's the same kind of thing. I do stand up, but obviously not on your level. But I'm also a musician, so when I'm performing, I do a lot of patter, for example. And one of the things that sets me apart with my singing group is that other singing groups don't seem to do the patter. And we get booked again and again because they're like, wait, you made the audience laugh in between the songs.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And that was a big deal for them. It's really interesting to me, Mike, how much you and I have in common. I'm a Jewish immigrant. I was born in the
Mm.
former Soviet Union and immigrated here when I was I was 7 here. We lived in Israel for a few months when I was 6. But yeah, and I'm the middle of 3 girls, so it's not quite the same the world revolves around you kind of situation. There's definitely a difference between the way an only son
Mm-hmm.
is treated and the way one of 3 girls is treated. But there's something that you said that I thought was really, I mean, everything you're saying is really cool to hear. But one of the last things you said was that it's a relationship with the audience, essentially, that oh, I like this. I want to keep it going. How do you establish it when you're up on stage with a good crowd versus a challenging crowd, for example? How do you establish that rapport with an audience?
Uh, a good question. Thanks for asking. I think that the answer is different depending where I am along my development. Like, let's say when I started out, I felt like I believed that the way to connect with the audience would be to have like the perfect opening joke. And I eventually, like the joke that I would come to open with, sort of exclusively or almost exclusively for years and years when I discovered it was I would get on stage and I would say, like the audience would be applauding because the host would have asked them to, and that was the practice.
Right.
Uh, and and then I would say, "Thank you very much. Let's have another round of applause when I'm done." Um, and the way that I would say it would imply that I wanted them to clap for the host that had just been generous to me, and like so, just immediately, it would usually get a laugh, and I'm like, good. And here's a funny thing that I are you familiar with Isaac Bashevis Singer,
Yes.
the Jewish folk writer? There's one story that he wrote that I think about a lot. That I think I read or heard as a kid where like a fool from a particular town of fools was out in the world, and was at a restaurant and was hungry and ordered something, and they were like, I'm still hungry, and they kept ordering things. They kept ordering things. They ordered almost everything on the menu. And I was like, man, when am I going to be full? And eventually orders a cookie, eats the cookie, and is like, oh man, now I'm full. If only I had known it was the cookie that would make me full, then I wouldn't have ordered all that other stuff. Um,
Mm.
and but in fact, not knowing it is, of course, the sum total. It's actually, there's a thing from Buddhism where the Buddha said, I think, the bucket is not filled by the last drop, and the bucket is not filled by the first drop. The bucket is filled by each drop. And so this person was filled not by the cookie, not by one other specific thing, but by each piece of food that he was eating. Sometimes I think about this with respect to like the way that I loved playing the guitar, and I was like, oh man, if only I'd been playing the guitar since age 4, think how much better I'd be, think how much I
Mm.
would have loved it. But I needed all the drops of like learning music theory and the violin lessons and learning where to put my finger, the pain of putting fingers on a stringed instrument like that. Eventually, when I was like, oh, it's easy to learn the guitar once you learned the violin for 12 years.
For sure.
Um,
No fingerboard on the violin. You have to do
oh,
it by ear.
it's so much easier to play the guitar. Like, I mean, so especially if you want to learn how to play guitar easily, just learn how to play the violin difficultly for a dozen years and you'll be on your way. And so the reason I thought about this story now, though, is because so I really did feel like that opening joke really helped the audience like relax and be like, oh, good, they've laughed immediately, right
Right.
away.
Right.
So that relationship of we laugh at your jokes is established. Whereas if it took, 30 seconds, a minute, or it didn't happen at all, then I would have felt like it wasn't. There was like one joke that I wrote long ago that became like the first good joke. I was like, oh man, when I tell this joke, then they know. It might have been before I had that opening line. I was like, if I tell this joke first, then they will trust me. Then they will understand that I am a funny person, a funny comedian, and then I don't even have to be as funny for the rest of this, like for the jokes that aren't as good as this. And there was like another town where, like nearby to Boston, where I was starting out, that I conceived of as like the people in this town are like they were raised differently than me. They like drinking more than I do. Like
Mm.
and ultimately I was afraid of them. And so I didn't do as well when I went there, probably for that reason, probably for the lack of confidence, not because they're any particularly, different background than I am. But eventually I wrote a joke about drinking that I was like, oh man, this is the joke that'll get these people on my side. And it worked, but I feel like ultimately looking back, I'm like, it was probably a placebo effect. Probably it was the sum total of all of the jokes that I'd written, all of the performances that I'd done, all of the actually gaining confidence in myself. Like it seemed like this magical thing that had changed, but it was really just the confidence where I felt like any one joke, you extract it from a set or from an act, like for the most part, like it's not going to like bring down the whole thing like a house of cards. It's like that these are all like particles. Man, there's so many things I want to say, but let's see. So I'm going to try to say them all, but whichever ones I get to, I'm Dayenu. Grateful for it. So my friend Ramin Nazer is a wonderful comedian and artist and podcaster, and he made the logos for my 2 podcasts, and he has made other art with me and for me, and I love him so much. Ramin Nazer, follow him, get his books, look at his art, and I saw on Instagram once, and it's probably in one of his books. He drew like this sort of colorful musical staff with a treble clef and a bunch of notes on it. And there's a note that is like anthropomorphized and has like a face, and it's saying something, and it's saying something like, I'm not part of a melody, I'm a note. And I love it so much, and it's true that a note is a note, and also it's a part of a melody. And it reminds me of sort of like the wave particle duality of nature, which I don't understand any more than sort of like as a cartoon itself. But I understand that, there's ways to look at light as particles, and there's ways to look at light as rays, as waves. And and that it's not that one is true and the other's false, but it's that from one perspective, like to my family, I am lovable. To other people who didn't know me, I'm, eventually lovable. Um, like they don't know that they're going to love me, but the question that the place that I've ultimately come to is like once I had that opening joke, I was like, oh yeah, this is the way in. But really, like now, one of my favorite ways to open a set is to riff on something that either just happened, that the audience experienced, that another comedian said, that happened that night, that was a something present, something, in that moment that
Mm.
perhaps only, that like if it was a joke connecting an experience that I had with, something that another comedian had right before that, if I'd never seen that comedian before, then it's something like special that could only have existed in that moment, which like sometimes when I was just on the road performing a few shows in Indianapolis and a few shows in Batavia, Illinois, and I'm working with like the same comedians throughout the weekend, each in each city. And so I remember after like the first show, I like would watch the other comedians and be like, oh wow, like I have a fun thing that I can say, like based on the thing that they have said.
Mm.
And like a thing that I've never said before because I couldn't, because I never heard them say that. And then I might create that experience anew for the rest of the audiences throughout the weekend. But I feel like, which I feel like is the way of like, one way of creating comedy in general is you say something spontaneously funny, people laugh at it, and you're like, oh, can I recreate the circumstances? Like in a laboratory, can I have this? Like this worked once. Will it work again? Can it work again? If I can, create the same environment and then set off the same catalyst. But anyway, the idea is like now I trust that I have descriptively, often enough, came
Mm.
out, said something that I was like, I'm going to say this, whether it's something that I have said before, haven't said before, and I'm going to trust that it's the right thing to say in that moment because I've had so many experiences where that has been the case, and
Mm.
also ones where it hasn't been, and also then I'm like, well, if this audience doesn't like this riff or riffing in general, then I'll move on to the material. And if this audience doesn't like riffing and or material, well, then we'll just all have a very sad time, and then and it'll end, and then I'll be grateful for the audiences that aren't like that.
Yep, that's it right there. To me, what you've been describing is sort of the ability to stay present. If you're able to see something that's just gone on and trust yourself enough to go, I saw this, I experienced it with the other comedian or something that we all, a waiter tripped or whatever happened, you're able to see it and you're able to go, okay, let me incorporate it into me being with you now. That's a is that a gift, a talent, a skill? How did that ability to stay present develop, and how do you now direct it?
Sure, thank you. That's another great and a good question. Often when I say something's a good question, it's because I don't immediately know the answer and I'm, vamping for time. Before I before I get into that, and or maybe in a way getting into it, there's I'll tell you about these two comedians that I knew from very early on. One you might be familiar with, Mark Maron.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
and then the other is a comedian who was like a big comedian in the Boston area since the '80s, and his name is Kevin Knox, and he died sometime like over a decade ago. Uh, but before that happened, he was like one of the most alive people that there was, and one of the ways he would host the equivalent, it was not called an open mic, but it was like an amateur showcase at the big comedy club in town when I was starting the Comedy Connection. And so every Monday he would be there, and every couple months I would get to be on that show, and I would see him do sometimes like the exact same words and the exact, like just with the same energy, and it was so impressive to see, because sometimes the room would be full, like hundreds of people. Sometimes the room would have just a dozen people in it. And it seemed to me that he was delivering like the exact same show for 1,000 people or for 3 people. And that was like admirable and impressive. He was doing the job.
Hmm.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, I remember hearing Mark Maron tell a story about being on a roast, and that writing, short, roast jokes wasn't his forte, wasn't what he got into comedy to do, but he was happy to be on the roast. But he's like, during the performance, it wasn't going great.
Mm.
His jokes weren't working, and at a point in the middle, he was just like acknowledged that he's like, this isn't working.
Mm.
uh, and then that sort of like, and maybe got his first big laugh. Perhaps the audience was like, oh, thank goodness he didn't think he was doing well. At least he's in touch with the same reality that we are. And that was what, to sort of, for answer, perhaps to answer the question, to speak for him, to put words in his mouth. Like if he was answering the last question, that's what connected him. That's what, started there being a rapport in the conversation with that audience. And then the rest of the set went well enough that they were able to, have the recorded version of it look good. But then I remember afterwards, there were like these old time comedians, like who were great at the roast, and that's why they were there. And they were like, you never let them know that you're not doing well. You never let them see you sweat. You never. And Mark's like, well, maybe that's what you do, but I let them see. If I'm sweating, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not sweating. I'm going to talk about the sweat. I'm going to get into the sweat. And I'm like, is this sweat this wet? And it's like, oh, I'm actually getting into it. That's me again. Mike Kaplan here. But so I remember having kind of as role models, like these two caricatures of the extremes of the way to be a comedian. One, being completely present with what is happening, even if it's not your favorite thing. Because sometimes, like when I'd be at open mics starting out, like I knew that was sort of to go back to another question you asked and add to that answer. One of the reasons that I was able to keep moving forward was that I learned and I understood that like nobody's good when they start. And so if you're like, I remember there was Richard Jenny, another rest in peace, amazing comedian. He was in there was a movie called Open Mic, a documentary about these open mic comedians and their journey, but also they interviewed like big comedians along the way about their open mic experiences. And I remember Richard Jenny saying something like, if you're starting out and you're getting up there and you feel like you suck, and it seems like everything is telling you that you suck, like you feel like it, the audiences are telling you that you suck, like it just seems like you suck and it's never going to stop sucking, it's like you're probably on the right track. Like that's just the way that it is. And so understanding that and being like, oh wow, if I do a 5-minute set and I tell 30 jokes and 2 of them work, like that wouldn't be a very good grade in school, but that is a good grade for a starting comedian. Be like, well, then those 2 jokes work. Maybe tomorrow I'll have 2 other jokes that work, and eventually I can build something. And so while I was at open mics, I was telling jokes. I was like, I know that these won't all work. I don't know which ones aren't going to work, but I got good at like, let's say I would start with a couple jokes that did work. And then if the third joke didn't work, there would always be a laugh possible by being like, oh, that one didn't work. Like, oh, good. Like kind of like a meta rule of 3, like joke works, joke doesn't work. Well, that's funny too. We expected the joke to work, but it didn't. And it's funny that the joke didn't work. And so I got good in between the jokes enough. So I feel like that is in part an answer to the question, how did I like become good at being in the moment or comfortable being in the moment, or how did I? It was just like in part by necessity, because I was at the time afraid of the silence of the joke not working. So I'm like, well, let me fill that with something else. Let me fill that with like an acknowledgement, an apology. I'm like, I'm so sorry that joke, whatever it was, like I would come to a place where I was like, well, okay, I thought that was funny, and I understand that you didn't think it was funny, but now can we both laugh at the fact that I thought it was funny? Isn't it funny that I thought that thing that clearly we both know now that wasn't funny? We're both much older and wiser now. You and me, audience, we're in this together, laughing at the past version of myself that nobody laughed at until now. And so that that is a thing that I guess I think that I can't I don't know if we're going to solve the whole nature nurture debate here. I bet it's both. I'm going to say it's both. I guess we did solve it, but
Ta-da!
the so the idea that how like I don't know if it is like what combination of natural talent compared to like working hard to to is it a muscle? It's certainly there's some component of it that is a muscle that if you try to if you do something over and over. They say that that's quote unquote insanity, which is kind of an ableist look, but a sort of a practical. There's something powerful to the metaphor, the idea that people say, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, you're crazy. But in fact, if you, do push-ups every day, you will get a different result. If you run every day, you will get a different result. If you write jokes every day, you will eventually, hopefully, get better at writing jokes. If you practice, saving the jokes that didn't work in between the jokes that did work every day, hopefully, I mean, descriptively, I did get better at it. And so there was no particular moment where I was there was no particular moment where I was like, now is when I got good at being in the moment. And it's all a matter of scale of like, I'm older now. I'm hopefully wiser now. I'm maybe better at, doing the things that I wasn't good at all at doing when I started. But it was in part because I liked having these. I mean, it was really great to have these role models of on the Mark Maron end of the spectrum. Be like, what can you do but be present with what is because the audience, especially when they can, it seems, sense that if you're not being genuine, if you're not being who you are, then what are you doing? Why are you trying to succeed on somebody else's measures and metrics? Like, I'd rather fail on my own than succeed at doing something that isn't me. And then on the Kevin Knox end of the spectrum, I was like, he also was truly being himself. He was that, that present with the material that he did, if not the same way every time, but the same material, the same jokes, the same act, like that he was like, a classic rock band that you went to see and you're like, man, I hope that they do, I hope Bob Dylan does Blowing in the Wind. And just like every night that you could see, like, it was trustworthy that Kevin Knox was Kevin Knox. And like, I mean, he had like I'm sure hours of material, but just he was so good at playing the hits, and Mark was so good at and is still so good at jazz improvisation of the self, and so it's like there's multiple ways to be a music. You could be a symphony orchestral performer. You can be a jazz improviser. You could be an improv comedian who loves riffing, or a stand-up who loves riffing. You could be somebody who does the equivalent of the like Stephen Wright. I feel like is a guy who he creates a symphony of his jokes. So I guess the answer to your question is I don't know.
And honestly, I wasn't expecting a definitive answer. So there you go. And it's funny because, I'm on stage. I had this happen once where this is the unexpected that you have to deal with. I'm on stage. There are 500 people. It's me and my guitar, and I go to tune up my E, and my high E breaks. And all of a sudden I'm there and I'm like, crap, I didn't prepare for this. And so I found myself having to riff while I'm on stage changing my guitar string to 500 people. And it was a real lesson in, you just have to do it. You can't ignore the fact that there's no E string. You have to be there, and you have to, so I guess I'm more like Mark Maron than I am like Kevin Knox. And that's okay. It's just interesting to me that as performers, as people who are, professional speakers in one sense or another, the unexpected is going to happen. And it's whether or not it throws you that's going to be a problem or a success story, depending on how you look at it. So within that framework, talking about solving problems and how you approach that, you have a body of work. You're constantly doing other things, but you're kind of diversified. And I also am a sort of a multi-discipline performer, artist, whatever, do you ever get confused about what you're trying to achieve, or do you have a big old plan that you're working?
Hmm. Uh, I love your questions, and I think that
Uh-oh.
oh no 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 I think this is my favorite one. I know exactly what I'm going to say. So, do you ever? I'm going to rephrase the question. Do you ever get confused, or maybe I'll say it exactly the way you said, about what you're doing because you're doing so many things, or do you have a big old plan? And I would say I don't often get confused about what I'm doing, and I don't have a big old plan.
All right.
Um, but I guess, and it's sort of like another one of these like Talmudic, great truth opposite situations. There's another a thing I like to talk about on stage sometimes that I learned that Niels Bohr, the physicist, once said: the opposite of a small truth is a lie, but the opposite of a profound truth is often another profound truth.
Mm.
And so I would say that there are times that I lean towards the confusion end of the spectrum, and there are times that I lean towards the big plan end of the spectrum, and they're both present. I mean, ultimately, when I started doing comedy, like 2002ish, is when I really decided that I wanted to keep pursuing comedy. I'd been performing, I'd performed at a comedy club for the first time in 1999, but I was still pursuing music at that time. So 2002, I was like, I found other places to do comedy. And that's when I was like, I'm starting doing comedy now, even though I'd sort of been, the comedy conception had happened in 1999, but the comedy birth, perhaps, when I became a comedy baby, 2002.
Long
Um,
gestation period. My
oh,
goodness.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I gestated for a little bit and I stopped. And it's also when it's a joke or a comedy career that is being not inoculated, what's the word, incubating,
Mm.
but hopefully inoculating also, if that's called the gestation period, of course. So
With a J. Got it.
yes. I'm sorry, I jest with a G. I moving forward, I I do a lot of things. Like, I love writing songs. I like writing poems and rhymes. I love writing jokes. So of the things that I love writing, like every morning, the three basic things that I do when I wake up: I drink a liter of water, I meditate, and I do free writing of some kind, usually on 750words.com, kind of a morning pages. Like, if you're familiar with The Artist's Way, I'm sure that you're at least familiar. I'm that it is a thing. I've actually never read it, but I know that one of the things is morning pages, and I also know that they recommend longhand writing, and I do that sometimes. But sometimes I type, and sometimes I have a very specific plan for what I'm typing. Sometimes I'm like making an email to my girlfriend or my mom or a friend if it's their birthday, or just whatever thing I want to do. Sometimes I know exactly what I want to do. Sometimes I'm like writing a chapter of a book. Sometimes I'm writing jokes for a project. Sometimes I'm writing lyrics to a song. Sometimes I don't have a specific plan when I start, and I just start. And then I'll see, like, sometimes, a joke nugget comes out. Sometimes a lyric nugget. Sometimes just, a gratitude journaling takes place. And so I'm glad. And again, I then will look back at what I wrote and be like, what did I write? Again, it's more descriptive than prescriptive.
Right.
And so sometimes I feel like that's a thread that, is connecting through all of this, is like, well, what did happen? Like, we might have desires of what we want to happen. Like, and I do, I'm so like I said, when I was starting out, as a comedian in 2002, my goal was to become only a comedian, was to become a full-time stand-up comedian that didn't have to, have the job that I had to make money, to live, to pay rent, to eat. And that I achieved that goal, the goal of only like needing comedy to pay for my food and rent, in 2008 or so. And like that, I had a year where I was like, if I make this much money every year, then I don't need to make money doing other things if I
Mm,
make this money from comedy.
mm-hmm,
And so in one way, like the big old plan has been achieved. And now the plan is to continue to maintain being a comedian and making I mean, the original plan was to be a musician. And I was like, okay, well, we're going to shift that plan because of what is happening, the organic nature to which I came to comedy or comedy came to me. And uh, yeah, so I think the plan now is like, in 2010, I think 2009, I recorded my first album, and then the plan was to create a new hour of comedy that I was like, that was the best jokes that I'd written up to that point. But then I was like, well, how do I do? And I remember like maybe in 2010 or 11, I did an hour of comedy that was brand new, that wasn't as good, but I was like, but I have a new hour, and now the goal is to have a new hour that is as good or better. And so then I recorded my next album in, I think, 2012, and then by that point though, I had like an hour and a half to 2 hours of new stuff that I was happy with. And so I then was able to keep like it seemed like the first hour took at least 7 years to get into shape, and then the second one came 3 or 4 years later. And then now it's at least every 3-ish years, I feel like I have a new hour of comedy that I am happy with, and I record it as an album or a special or both. And then I start or continue the process of moving forward towards the next hour. And at this point, like, it used to be just, an hour of jokes that I liked. And then little by little, like, I gained, like, I found myself putting more both structure and meaning to what I was doing. Not that I wasn't doing things with meaning, but like the first couple albums that I put out are, a series of jokes.
mm-hmm,
Like Mike Birbiglia, another comedian, a friend and a guy who I look up to a lot. His first joke was called Two Drink Mike, and it was there was no narrative through line. It was just an album full of wonderful jokes. And then he started doing one-man shows like Sleepwalk with Me and I think my girlfriend's boyfriend, or something. As such, the new one is one that he brought to Broadway, and now there are all these one-person shows full of wonderful jokes, but also full of some greater narrative arc as well. And in the beginning of my comedy career, and still, like, I'm like, he's doing him, and I'm not aiming to do that. But I did find myself in the album that I released in, I think, 2017 called No Kidding, which sort of the seeds of which started being planted in, like, I don't know, 2011, 2012. I think I dated a woman in 2011-ish who we broke up eventually, in part because like she definitely wanted multiple children soon, and I didn't want that at the time, and was not optimistic that I would, or not confident. I didn't think that was my path, and so we loved each other, and we cared about each other a lot, and we loved being together, and it was sad to part. And so I was sort of swimming in those thoughts and feelings and ideas for a while, and I wrote a lot of jokes about not wanting children, and about how, and they sort of like grew, like more and more grew out of that idea. And I was like, I wonder if I could do a whole hour of sort of stemming from this, and that did become the album No Kidding, all from the place of my not wanting kids.
mm-hmm.
And then the next hour, which is my newest album thus far, as of this recording, AKA, came from a similar process, but even more so. I was like, wow, maybe I can, instead of just writing, like in the beginning of a comedy career, it was all like, anything that's funny. I'm going to make the funniest things. The audience, what you think is funny, what I think is funny, whatever we agree, that's what it's going to be. I have no real agency. I'm just like accepting what's coming at me.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I don't know, like agency is also sort of a relative term, like, because I don't really have control over the thoughts that I have. I can like steer in a direction. And I realized that, though. I was like, oh, I don't have to just wait for ideas to come, and I can like start writing about the things that I want to write about, that I care about. I learned that, like, oh, I can at least, if not, I don't know, steer or shape, or like I can head in a direction. I can
Hmm.
face away, and then as time moves me forward, and as ideas and things come at me, I'm like, oh, and like the thoughts that I have will be shaped by the books that I read, the other people that I spend time with, the ways that I spend my life. And so like starting meditation was something that had a great impact on my both like the time that I spent meditating, and then also like seeping into the rest of my life. And so now, I mean, the overall plan is to continue to like create shows, to create jokes, the little notes of the shows that are the symphonies. And so like right now, there's an hour of comedy that I'm working on that's in shape. That the plan will be to record it as a special at some point in the next year, 2 years, however, whenever it seems like it is, safe and healthy and possible to have the optimal circumstances for it to be as done as I want it to be, and then recorded and released to the people. And then there's also now another hour-ish, a few other like hour-ishes of comedy ideas that I have. I'm like, I might want to do one about, like, this one's all about my relationship with my girlfriend for the most part, and my growth in life, in our togetherness. And the next hour might be about my grandmother who died last year, or who died in 2020. I'm still saying last year on all my checks.
Yeah,
And
we all are.
uh, my grandmother died, and I loved and love her very much. And so I that was the experience that I was having for a while, and still am having. And so I love that I've been thinking about her and writing jokes and having thoughts about her. So maybe there'll be an hour of comedy that is either all about her, that has a significant chunk of material about her, and so that might be the next one after this one. And then there's just other jokes. And even now, as I'm saying this, I'm like, that's a plan that might come to fruition and might not, because the there's a scene, I think it's a, if not a deleted scene, like an extra scene from the movie Comedian that Seinfeld made, a documentary over 20
Hmm.
years ago now,
Hmm.
where I love this part where he's talking about how sometimes you have a joke that you really want to work, and so you try every which way to get it to work, and you're like, I really like this, I love it so much, but it's like the audiences aren't responding to it necessarily at the way that you want them to. And you're like, come on, like you're tweaking it, and it's like a baby bird that you're trying to teach to fly. The isn't a sort of a metaphor that he's like, and you're like, you're putting on a chicken suit, and you're like flapping your wings, and you're like this joke, fly like this. And he's like, and then some other jokes that you might even not care about as much just come out of the nest of the brain fully formed, and they just fly immediately. They're like, I am a joke. And again, I feel like that's another sort of like, spectrum from one end to the other, like the Mark Maron, Kevin Knox one, where it's like, sometimes you have one, sometimes you have the other. Like the best case is when, the thing that you really love comes naturally, and then you also work to make it better and better and better. Perhaps that's the optimal. But then sometimes it's fun to work on, like to tinker on one that might never be in the shape that you think it deserves. And sometimes you have ones where you're like, well, I said that off the cuff, I don't even care about it. I'm like, well, I'm gonna keep saying it because audiences like it.
Right.
And so uh this is all to say, I don't know, I'm pretty optimistic that the next hour of comedy that I record will be this one that I'm working on, because if anyone's in charge, I am, of my own what I do. And then, but honestly, right now, I don't know who is in charge of the next one. Is it going to be the one that's like, hey, it's this one, it's these topics, it's this joke, this is what is important to you right now? Like, because a week ago, I was performing in Batavia, Illinois, and I did 4 shows. And for 2 of them, I did the newest, honed, completed, curated show that will be the next thing I record. And for 2 of them, like the final show of the weekend was January 1st. And the night, so many people had come out, like packed audiences for the New Year's Eve shows. New Year's Eve, a big event, comedy destination. But for the final show that Saturday night, it had also like sort of blizzarded, and so there was only 24 people there.
Oh wow.
But they were, and in a place that was like could seat a couple hundred.
Right.
But 24 people is still like they were there. They had come for a show. They had braved a blizzard. They were like, we're not just coming because it's the thing to do on New Year's Eve. We're coming the next night. We had, our big night or whatever it is, but now we're here to see this show. And I love like a small, an intimate crowd as such. And so for them, I did like the newer things that are beyond, that honed, curated thing. Like some things in the moment, talking to specific people in the audience about, their like a show that couldn't have happened without those specific people. With some jokes that are like that were prepared and that I was happy to share because I'm like, these are newer works of art that I'm happy with. But also in between, just so much more, just a riffing mortar in between the joke bricks, and so like both of those things are like those are my two favorite ways to do comedy. One, for everything to go exactly the way that I plan it to the maximum, and the other for it to be completely up in the air what is going to happen at all, and for it to be enjoyable for me and the audience to the maximum. So this is to say that I do sometimes have a plan for a particular show, for a particular joke, for a particular career. Maybe talk to me in 10 years and I'll have become a viral TikTok music star. I
Why not?
don't know. Like sometimes people ask, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I'm like, I look back at 5 years ago and think about how incomprehensible where I am right now would have been to that person then. And it's such a, hubris almost, to be like, here's what for any person in the world, in America, who had plans before, 2020, before the pandemic, before like the idea, which is in a way, I mean, first of all, like, sort of, there's of course tragedy. And also there's a sense on at least this local chronological level, freedom, to be like, I thought I knew what the future was. We all have ideas of what we think the future is or could be or what we want it to be. And then it was like, oh man, I miss 2018 when I knew what the future was. But it's all that's all an illusion. The idea that we can, maybe there are certain things that we can make happen, in the very local level of our consciousness. Maybe not even that. But yeah, so I guess I would say I can be confused sometimes, and I also can have a plan, and I can also hopefully not attach to either of those circumstances, as unless it serves me. There's one other Ramin Nazer cartoon that I'm just reminded of now, where it's something like he's a musician as well, and he's like, if you in the Western scale, like classic piano, there's 12 different notes, right? And that in most of your scales or modes, you use 7 of them. And so there's like 7 that are in the key and 5 that aren't in the key, right? And he says, if you find yourself in music playing a note that's not in the key, all you have to do to get to one that is in the key is go a half step in either direction. You're
Right.
always half a step away from being either in harmony or in the flow. And so, like, metaphorically, that makes sense as well. Like, if I feel confused, then I can then take a half step and be like, I feel confused. And I'm at least less confused in saying that than I was in whatever was causing the confusion earlier, just sort of on the, the most local momentary scale. And then I think I come from a planning family, a planning perhaps culture, maybe all of society, maybe it's white supremacy as well as Jewish history or just the specifics of my parents as well. But the idea of like this happens at this time in this way, like having a plan, having a schedule is something that, whether it comes natural to me or nurtural to me, I think of myself as like, time is something that I think about a lot. And it's something that I have been grateful to be able to let go of sometimes when it's like, well, this is supposed to happen at this time, but it's not going to. So am I going to be sad about it, or am I going to accept it? So like I've gotten better at like letting go of a plan when the plan ought be let go of.
You sound like my friend Alec, who calls himself a Buddhist Jew. Uh,
Hmm.
that's really interesting. So there's a lot to unpack here, and honestly, Mike, I could keep you here for like the next 6 hours talking
Mm-hmm.
with you. But I know you have a life to get back to. So I'm gonna say a couple of things that I would love for you to chat about. We didn't get to talk about my favorite set of jokes by you, the Mario jokes, but we will. I want to
Mm-hmm.
have you back if you're willing to come back and talk more in depth about some of this. But I would love it. We mentioned that you have podcasts and you have albums. Would you do me a favor? Could you people learn different ways, and so all of this stuff is going to be in the show notes, but I would love it if you could just run down a little bit about some of the albums and the podcasts, what they are, why you have to, just sort of so that if you're listening to this, you obviously know you have to go follow Mike Kaplan, become a fan of his because he's awesome. And this is going to be the information that will get you there. So if you wouldn't mind, Mike, just saying what those are, I would really appreciate it.
Sure. I thank you very much for the invitation. So Mike Kaplan is my name, and the way that I spell it, that if you want to search for me anywhere, is Myqkaplan. So Kaplan, a standard way, Mike, an unstandard way, another yin yang of sorts. So Myqkaplan. The various social medias that exist, you can find me there. My website, mikekaplan.com, you can find me there. Uh, on most places where you can find albums and comedy or music online. You can find me by searching my name there. My most recent album is called AKA, and it was released by Blonde Medicine. They're the record label I work with now. And so if you go to blondemedicine.com, you can find various ways. I'll send you the direct link, which will bring you to the album on their site. And you can get it however streamable and downloadable you would like it, or even a quote unquote physical copy. I
Ooh.
don't know why I put quotes around it, but yeah,
I was going to say,
uh,
what
yeah.
do the quotes mean when it comes to the physical copy? But okay,
Great
keep.
question. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the idea that the material is going to go into your ears in a non-physical way, but I guess also it is physical because sound waves are as well. So they're all physical, but yes, there's a compact disc available if you would like
Tangible,
it. Yes,
tangible.
tangible, absolutely love it. Yes. So, yeah, that if you were going to listen to only one of my albums, I think that is because it's the most recent one. It is the most representative of who I am today and what I'm doing now, and I'm very happy with it and proud of it. So, if you only remember one thing, AKA the album, and then there are the various other albums that have come before, which are No Kidding, Meet Robot, and Vegan Mind Meld, and then one that's also available as an album and a special on Amazon, which is, as you mentioned, Small, Dork, and Handsome. And the two podcasts I have are Broccoli and Ice Cream, which I've done for several years, where I talk to usually one guest at a time about having. I had a previous podcast called Hang Out With Me, where I would usually have two guests, and it would just be like a fun, bouncy conversation of like, I would call it fun, meaning both or neither. And now my goal with Broccoli and Ice Cream is to have conversations where I get to know people. I have two separate talks with them, one about the broccoli of their life, the work of their life, whatever that means to them. It could be their creativity, it could mean their job, it could mean therapy, it could mean whatever work is, and wherever that conversation goes. That's the plan, and I don't necessarily stick to it. And then the ice cream of their life is the joy. And so what brings people joy, I ask, like when they're not working, when even knowing that of course one's work might bring a person joy, but what are the non-work joys that a person has, their passions, their hobbies, the way their self-care regimen, whatever it might be. Do they have a faith tradition? Do they meditate? And so each week or so, one of those comes out for free, and the other conversation is available on my Patreon. So that's a way to get more or all of the content of me, is to go to my Patreon, which is also, of course, patreon.com/Mike Kaplan. And I guess the final way to be in touch and to receive things from me and of me is I started. I'm sorry. The final way coming soon, right after I say. So the Faucet is my other podcast that I essentially just do on my own. That I started doing during the initial phases of the lockdown in the pandemic of 2020. I imagine this could be available, infinitely into the future.
We hope so.
Um, and so I was doing some online shows, Zoom shows, like Instagram lives and such. And I was doing a lot of in the moment stuff because it seemed like not the thing to do to just tell jokes as though I was in front of an audience the same way that I was the year prior, when so many things seemed different. So that seemed like another good nudge to be in the moment. And so my girlfriend, Rini, who I live with, who was around and is around so many of the times that I do my live shows from our home, or our online shows from our home, she was like, "You just did like an hour of almost brand new things. Like you could just have a new podcast where it's that all the time, just a new hour of talking or 10 minutes or however long you want." Because she's like, "You're essentially a faucet that you can turn on and just spout a stream of consciousness into the world of listeners' ears." And so she came up with the concept and the name, The Faucet. And so my initial podcast was, me and two guests. Then Broccoli and Ice Cream is me and one guest. The Faucet is me and usually no guests. So my next podcast won't even have me. And
Dead air. I love it.
yeah. The final point of where people can find things from me is at mikekaplan.substack.com, where I started also in the past year. I used to have a mailing list that I would send out that would only tell people about shows that I was doing. And that was, sometimes if you're on my mailing list because you like me and you want to support what I'm doing, but you live in one place and and I'm usually only doing shows in one place, once a year, maybe a couple times a year. So if I'd send out these mailing lists, like I would always lose people when I would send out the mailing list, because they'd be like, "Oh, people are minimizing," and that's great. I support that. But now I joined Substack, and so I converted my mailing list to be there. But for the most part, every week I just send out 3 jokes, or 3 fun units, I call them sometimes, because sometimes they're poems, sometimes they're jokes, sometimes they're just like nice things that I want to share, like that I have usually created, or sometimes I'll share like, "Oh, like, hey, this person created some art based on one of my jokes," or what have you. And then at the bottom, I'll also be like, "Here's some upcoming shows." But for the most part, it is just something that I want to share, like, joyfully to people who want to receive. Like, I do put jokes on social media. If you follow me on those platforms, you can get them. But you can also get it direct to your inbox once a week for free, or you can subscribe for even more. And it's just like, there's a nice little community of friends and fans that I'm always happy to see, when people are, liking things, commenting on things, responding to things. So if you want to be a part of that, then you can join and receive there as well. But yeah, the main thing I guess I would say is my stand-up. So if you can see it live, when that's safe and healthy and possible, I'd love for you to do that. In the meantime, those are the online from a distance options.
Yay. Thank you for clarifying and stating all of that, because it was going to take me a very long time to describe all of it. So I'm glad you did it for me. I am so, so grateful. And again, I would love for you to come back, because I would love to go delve deeper into your writing process, especially that Mario joke.
Oh,
And
sure.
also the notion of like setup punchline. I took my first comedy class I took with Chris Griggs at People's Improv Theater. And that was what it was setup punchline, setup punchline. That's how you come up with your 5-minute set. And that is counter to the way my brain works. So I would love to delve with you into your writing process next time. We've got lots of time, hopefully. As you said earlier, we can plan all we want, but then life happens. But I'm super grateful to you for taking the time to be here and to chat with me about all of this incredible stuff. I just have one last question,
Sure.
and I ask everybody who comes on the show this question. And it's a silly question, but I find that it can yield some profound answers. And here it is. If you had an airplane that could skywrite anything for the whole world to see, what would you say?
Hmm. That's really nice. I'm gonna first say, to give my subconscious brain a little time to work on it. There is. Do you know the comedian Kurt Braunohler?
No.
Kurt, if I understand this correctly, Kurt, he's wonderful. I recommend. He has an album. I believe the title of the album is based on a Kickstarter that he did to raise, I think, $6,000, $8,000, whatever it took to hire a skywriter to to write out in the sky, "How do I land?" Uh, it's so whenever I think about skywriting, I always think about that. It's so he hired somebody to do it. They took a picture of it, and I believe that picture is the album cover, and the album is called "How Do I Land?"
Oh, that's
And
great.
it's really wonderful. So now, okay, let's see what my brain has. What have you come up with, brain? If
Da
I
da 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 da.
if I had an airplane that could skywrite anything for the entire world to see, oh boy, here's some finalists. Hi, mom, and hello, I love you, Rini.
Aw.
My girlfriend's name. I guess the question is like how much do we have room for? Like, is it only a sentence? Is it a paragraph? And depending how much time I had to plan it, I guess a transcript of this entire podcast, that would be a possibility. Um,
That's a lot of gas.
oh yeah. So probably a shorter thing. There's a Shunryu Suzuki quote that I like a lot. It's something like, "You are perfect as you are, and you could use a little improvement." Um, and I mean, so many. There's a story of a Buddhist. I've been learning about Buddhism recently a lot. I really like it. And there's a story of a Buddhist master who was asked, like, the Buddha said like 84,000 pieces of advice or instructions or thoughts, on ways to live. That's a lot. Can you like sum it up in one? And the master said, everything changes. And so I'm like, oh, that could be, I don't know if that's a useful thing to have in the sky, a reminder. Ooh, there's a guide who I went to who led meditations with ayahuasca. He would always say, or often would say at the beginning, he would say, "The effects come and the effects go," and it was to speak of specifically the experiences that you had during that psychedelic experience,
Mhm.
and also it's true of, it seems so far, every emotional state that I've had, every anxiety that I was feeling last year. I'm not feeling the exact one now.
Mhm.
It has come and it is gone, and that is also like a useful a thing to remember. So I guess that's where I've come to. My skywriting would say, "The effects come, the effects go," and probably the skywriting would disappear, demonstrating its own truth.
Perfect.
Hmm. Or wet paint. I think that'd be fun.
Do not lean, right? Well, again, Mike, thank you so much for being on the show. And incidentally, the whole thing with the artist's way, it's funny that you said that. Before we get off this podcast episode, every Tuesday right now, literally on the show, I am leading and sort of facilitating three
Hmm.
other artists to go through the artist's way. That's exact. We just had our first episode this past Tuesday. So actually,
Cool.
yes, I've been doing some aspect of morning pages since 1997. And
Hmm.
now I'm facilitating another group learning. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. Again, thank you so much for being on the show. This was super fun, and I hope you'll come back. You're welcome back anytime.
I would love to. It's been a great pleasure and an honor. I thank you so much for inviting me, for having me, and thank you to everyone listening. It's been fun.
Awesome. And this is, once again, Isolde Trachtenberg for the Innovative Mindset Podcast, reminding you to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're new, and it would mean the world to me if you told a friend about it. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2021. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, remember to be bold, be creative, and most of all, be kind.